He doesn't understand what's happening. One moment his person is there, the person who means everything, the center of his entire world. They're in the car together, which usually means something good. Maybe the park, maybe somewhere new to explore. His tail wags because his person is near, and when his person is near, everything is right. Then the car stops. A door opens. His person gets out, and he follows because that's what he does, he follows. Always. But then something strange happens. His person walks away. Fast, not the usual pace. And when he tries to follow, there's a command. Stay. He knows this word. It means wait, be patient, they'll come back. So he sits, he waits. His person gets back in the car, the engine starts. And then, the unthinkable, the car drives away. He doesn't understand. There must be a mistake. Surely they'll realize, turn around, come back. He waits where he was told to wait because he's a good dog, because he does what he's told. Minutes pass. Then hours. The sun moves across the sky. He's still waiting. Because that's what stay means. You wait until they come back. They always come back. But this time, they don't. This is the psychology we're exploring today. What happens in the mind and heart of a dog when they're abandoned by the person they love most in the world? And to understand this, we need to understand something that many people don't fully grasp. Dogs aren't just animals that live with us. They're animals whose entire evolutionary history has been intertwined with ours, whose brains developed in relationship to human brains, whose capacity for attachment and love is not metaphorical, but neurologically real. A dog doesn't think in words the way we do, but they experience emotions that are remarkably similar to human emotions. When neuroscientists study dog brains using MRI technology, they find that dogs have the same brain structures we do for processing emotion. The amygdala, the hippocampus, the areas that generate feelings of joy, fear, anxiety, and love. And critically, they have the same neurochemical systems for bonding that humans do, primarily involving oxytocin, the so-called love hormone. When a dog looks at their human, their oxytocin levels spike. When they're near their person, their stress hormones decrease and their contentment hormones increase. This isn't anthropomorphism or sentimental projection. This is measurable neurobiology. Dogs genuinely bond to their humans in ways that are chemically and structurally similar to how human children bond to parents, or how romantic partners bond to each other. So when a dog is abandoned, they're not just confused about a change in routine. They're experiencing the rupture of their primary attachment bond, the relationship that organized their entire psychological and emotional world. And because they can't understand human reasons or circumstances, they can't make sense of why this is happening. They only know that the center of their universe has disappeared. In those first hours and days, an abandoned dog typically goes through stages that animal behaviorists have documented. First, there's confusion and active searching. The dog stays near where they were left, pacing, looking in the direction the car went, whining or barking. They're trying to signal their location, trying to fix what they assume is a mistake. Surely their person is looking for them. Surely this separation is accidental. Then comes what researchers call protest behavior. The dog becomes more agitated, more vocal. They might try to follow the scent trail, might run in the direction they last saw their person. There's genuine panic in this phase, driven by the same neurological systems that create panic in a human child separated from a parent. The dog's stress hormones are flooding their system. Their heart rate is elevated. They're in fight or flight mode, except there's nothing to fight and nowhere meaningful to flee. If the person doesn't return, and in cases of true abandonment, they don't, the dog eventually enters a different phase, despair. The active searching stops. The vocalizations decrease. The dog becomes quieter, more withdrawn, more still. This isn't acceptance or peace. This is what psychologists would recognize in humans as depression, a shutting down of energy and hope when a vital attachment figure is irrevocably gone. Some abandoned dogs maintain vigil at the spot where they were left for days or even weeks, barely eating, not sleeping properly, just waiting. There are documented cases of dogs who remained at the place of abandonment until they died, still waiting, This isn't stupidity or simple animal behavior. This is the power of attachment, the same force that makes humans unable to let go of people they love even when logic says they should. The cruelty of dog abandonment is that it exploits the very thing we bred into dogs over 30,000 years of coevolution: their capacity for unconditional attachment to humans. We selected for dogs who would bond to us deeply, who would be loyal, who would trust us completely. And then when that bond becomes inconvenient, some humans simply break it, leaving the dog to deal with psychological trauma they have no framework to understand. To understand why abandonment is so psychologically devastating for dogs, we need to understand the neurobiology of attachment. And here we turn to the work of John Bowlby, the British psychiatrist who developed attachment theory in the 1950s and 60s. While Bowlby was studying human children, his insights apply remarkably well to dogs, and modern research has confirmed that the attachment systems in both species function in strikingly similar ways. Bowlby proposed that attachment isn't just learned behavior or conditioning, it's a biological imperative, an evolved system that ensures vulnerable individuals stay close to protective caregivers. In humans, infants are born helpless and need years of care to survive. Evolution solved this problem by making infants capable of forming powerful emotional bonds to caregivers, bonds that motivate both the infant to seek proximity and the caregiver to provide it. Dogs, through domestication, have been essentially neotenized. They retain juvenile characteristics throughout their lives, including the attachment systems that in wolves would diminish after puppyhood. Adult dogs maintain puppy-like attachment to humans, treating their owner as what Bowlby called a secure base, the safe haven they return to when frightened, the source of comfort and security that allows them to explore the world. Neurologically, this attachment is mediated primarily by the oxytocin system. When a dog and their human make eye contact, both experience a surge of oxytocin, the same hormone that bonds human mothers to infants. This creates a positive feedback loop. The dog looks at the human. Both get oxytocin, both feel good, both want to repeat the interaction. Over time, this builds a powerful neurochemical bond. Studies using fMRI to scan dog brains while they smell their owner's scent show activation in the caudate nucleus, a brain region associated with reward and positive expectation. The scent of their person literally activates the reward centers in a dog's brain more strongly than food or other dogs. Their human isn't just someone they live with. Their human is the most rewarding thing in their world. The attachment system also involves the stress response system. When a dog is separated from their secure base, their hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis activates, releasing stress hormones like cortisol. In normal separations, when the owner leaves for work but returns reliably, the dog learns to tolerate this temporary stress. The HPA axis activates but then deactivates when reunion occurs. The dog learns, separation happens but reunion always follows. But in abandonment, there's no reunion. The HPA axis remains activated. Stress hormones stay elevated. The dog's body remains in a state of high alert, waiting for a reunion that never comes. Over time, this chronic stress has profound effects: suppressed immune function, disrupted sleep, decreased appetite, behavioral changes. The dog's entire physiology is organized around the expectation of reunion, and when that expectation is continuously violated, systems start breaking down. Bowlby identified several attachment styles in children based on how their caregivers responded to them. Secure attachment develops when caregivers are consistently available and responsive. Anxious attachment develops when caregivers are inconsistent. Avoidant attachment develops when caregivers are regularly unavailable or rejecting. Dogs show similar patterns. A dog with a reliable, loving owner develops secure attachment. They're confident, well-adjusted, able to explore knowing they can return to safety. But abandonment doesn't fit any of these categories. It's not inconsistency or unavailability, it's complete rupture. Bowlby didn't extensively study what happens when an attachment bond is suddenly and permanently severed in early research, but later attachment researchers have, and the findings are grim. Complete loss of an attachment figure, especially when sudden and unexplained, creates what's called disorganized attachment. a state where the individual has no coherent strategy for dealing with stress because the source of safety has simply vanished. In dogs, this manifests as either hypervigilance or shutdown. Some abandoned dogs become frantically attached to any human who shows them attention, desperately trying to recreate the bond they lost. Others become withdrawn and unresponsive, having learned that attachment leads to devastating loss. Both responses are trauma adaptations, attempts to cope with an experience their brain was never designed to handle. Bowlby emphasized that attachment behavior isn't weakness or dependency. It's an evolved strategy for survival. A dog attaching to a human isn't being needy or pathetic. They're following millions of years of mammalian evolution that says, bond to protective figures, stay near them, and you'll survive. We bred dogs specifically to enhance this tendency, to make them more attached, more loyal, more focused on humans than any wild animal would be. So when we abandon them, we're not just inconveniencing an animal, we're violating a biological contract that we created through selective breeding. We made them this way, dependent, trusting, deeply bonded. And then some humans exploit that dependence by simply walking away when the bond becomes inconvenient. Research on dogs in shelters shows persistent changes in stress hormones and behavior that suggest long-term psychological impact. Dogs who've been abandoned often show elevated baseline cortisol even in safe environments. Their nervous systems have been recalibrated toward vigilance and anxiety. They startle more easily, trust less readily, take longer to relax. Their brains have been changed by the trauma of losing their secure base. The neuroscience makes clear what common sense suggests. Dogs aren't robots or objects. They're sentient beings with emotional lives, with attachment systems, with the capacity for psychological suffering. When we abandon them, we're inflicting genuine trauma, creating lasting changes in brain function and stress response that the dog will carry for the rest of their life. This isn't metaphorical or sentimental. It's neurobiology. The psychological consequences of abandonment in dogs are profound and, in many cases, permanent. While some dogs eventually recover, especially if they're adopted into stable, loving homes quickly, many carry the trauma for life. Understanding these consequences requires recognizing that dogs, like humans, have psychological lives that can be damaged by traumatic experiences. Depression is the first and most obvious consequence. Yes, dogs can experience depression, and it looks remarkably similar to human depression. Veterinary behaviorists recognize canine depression as a legitimate condition, characterized by decreased interest in activities the dog once enjoyed, decreased appetite, excessive sleeping, lethargy, and withdrawal from social interaction. Physiologically, it involves the same neurotransmitter imbalances, decreased serotonin and dopamine, that characterize human depression. An abandoned dog who ends up in a shelter often shows these symptoms dramatically. They lie in the back of their kennel, unresponsive. They don't eat, or eat very little. They don't react to stimuli that would normally excite a dog. Other dogs, toys, people walking by. They've shut down emotionally as a protective mechanism. The world has become too painful to engage with, so they withdraw into themselves. Anxiety is another pervasive consequence, particularly separation anxiety. Dogs who've been abandoned often develop extreme fear of being left alone again. Even after adoption into a new home, they may panic when their new person leaves, destroying furniture, urinating and defecating indoors, barking constantly, trying to escape. This isn't bad behavior or spite. It's trauma response. The dog's nervous system has learned that separation can be permanent, that when their person leaves, they might never return. So every departure triggers survival panic. Trust issues develop predictably. The dog's fundamental assumption about the world, that humans are safe, that bonds are reliable, that attachment is reciprocal, has been shattered. Some dogs respond by becoming indiscriminately friendly, desperately seeking connection with any human, unable to be alone for even a moment. They're trying to replace what they lost, to fill the void, but the neediness is often overwhelming for potential adopters, creating a tragic cycle where the dog's trauma responses make them harder to place in homes. Other dogs go the opposite direction, becoming fearful and withdrawn around humans. They've learned that humans are dangerous, that trust leads to abandonment. These dogs cower, avoid eye contact, sometimes snap or bite if cornered. This isn't aggression in the typical sense. It's fear-based defense. The dog is trying to protect themselves from being hurt again. Rehabilitating these dogs requires months or years of patient, consistent work to rebuild what abandonment destroyed. Learned helplessness is another documented consequence. This concept, first identified by psychologist Martin Seligman, describes what happens when an individual experiences repeated trauma they can't control or escape. They learn that their actions don't matter, that nothing they do changes outcomes, and they stop trying. Abandoned dogs in shelters often show this. They don't try to get adopted, don't present themselves appealingly, just lie there passively accepting their fate because they've learned that nothing they do matters. Behavioral problems proliferate. Some abandoned dogs become destructive, chewing furniture, tearing up belongings, as a way of managing anxiety and frustration. Some become reactive, barking and lunging at other dogs or people. Some develop obsessive behaviors, spinning, tail chasing, excessive licking. These are coping mechanisms, ways the traumatized nervous system tries to regulate itself when normal regulation has broken down. The capacity for joy often diminishes. Dogs are generally joyful animals. They play, they're enthusiastic, they express delight openly, but abandoned dogs frequently lose this. They become muted, subdued, going through the motions of life without the spark that characterizes healthy dogs. Play behavior decreases. Tail wagging becomes rare. The eyes, which in happy dogs are bright and engaged, become dull and distant. It's heartbreaking to witness because you're seeing a creature whose capacity for happiness has been damaged. Reattachment becomes difficult. Even when adopted into loving homes, many abandoned dogs struggle to fully bond with new owners. They remain somewhat detached, holding part of themselves back, unable to trust completely. Some never sleep deeply, always remaining semi-alert. Some never fully relax into affection, accepting pets but not melting into them the way securely attached dogs do. They've learned that attachment is dangerous, and even in safe circumstances, they can't fully unlearn that lesson. Physical health often suffers too, though the mechanisms are psychological. Chronic stress suppresses immune function, making the dog more susceptible to illness. Stress-related gastric issues are common. Some dogs develop compulsive disorders, acral lick dermatitis, where they lick one spot until it's raw and infected. The body and mind aren't separate, and psychological trauma manifests physically. Perhaps most tragically, some abandoned dogs never recover. Despite the best efforts of shelters, rescues, and adopters, some dogs remain so psychologically damaged that they can't function in homes. They're too anxious, too reactive, too shut down. These dogs often spend years in shelters or bounce between foster homes, never finding stability because abandonment broke something fundamental in their psyche that can't be repaired. This doesn't mean recovery is impossible. Many abandoned dogs do heal, do learn to trust again, do form new bonds. But it requires time, patience, understanding, and often professional behavioral help. And even dogs who recover often carry subtle remnants of the trauma: slight wariness, tendency toward anxiety, need for extra reassurance. Abandonment changes them permanently. They can be happy again, but they're never quite the same dog they would have been without that experience. Now we need to turn the lens around and ask a difficult question. What's happening psychologically in a human who abandons a dog? This is uncomfortable territory because it requires us to consider that abandonment isn't always simple cruelty. Sometimes it's a complex intersection of circumstance, ignorance, and psychological mechanisms that allow people to do something that from the outside looks unconscionable. Let's be clear, some abandonments are acts of callousness or cruelty. Some people get dogs impulsively, tire of them, and discard them like objects. Some people never saw the dog as a living being with emotional needs in the first place. These cases exist, and there's no psychological justification for them. They represent failures of empathy and moral responsibility. But many abandonments happen in more complicated contexts. A family loses their home and can't find rental housing that accepts dogs. A person develops severe illness and has no one to care for their pet. Someone is fleeing domestic violence, and the shelter doesn't take animals. An elderly person goes into assisted living that doesn't allow dogs. Financial crisis makes it impossible to afford veterinary care or even food. These are desperate circumstances, and while abandonment still inflicts trauma on the dog, understanding the human psychology involved is more complex. When someone abandons a dog in these desperate circumstances, several psychological mechanisms often activate to make the unbearable bearable. Rationalization is the first, telling yourself stories that minimize the harm you're doing. Dogs are resilient, he'll be fine. Someone will find him and take him in. He's better off without me if I can't care for him properly. These aren't necessarily true, but they're psychologically necessary for the person to live with their decision. Dissociation is another mechanism. Some people describe the act of abandonment as feeling unreal, like they're watching themselves do it from outside their body. This psychological distancing is a way of protecting the self from the full emotional impact of what's happening. If you fully felt the betrayal you're committing, the pain you're causing a being who loves you unconditionally, it might be unbearable, so the mind protects itself by making the experience feel less real. Dehumanization, or in this case de-animalization, is crucial. The ability to abandon a dog often requires seeing them as less than they are. It's just a dog. Animals don't have feelings like we do. He'll forget about me in a week. These beliefs, whether consciously held or unconsciously adopted for the moment, allow a person to act in ways that would be impossible if they fully recognized the dog's emotional reality. Shame and guilt are powerful forces that often drive secrecy around abandonment. Most people who abandon dogs don't talk about it, don't tell friends or family what they did. This suggests they know at some level that their action is wrong. But instead of changing the action, they hide it, creating a secret they carry. This unprocessed shame can lead to defensive reactions, anger when confronted, doubling down on justifications, blaming external circumstances entirely, rather than acknowledging personal responsibility. Attachment theory applies to humans who abandon as well. John Bowlby's framework suggests that people who struggle with attachment in their own lives, who have histories of unstable relationships, who avoid emotional intimacy, who have insecure attachment styles from their own childhoods, are more likely to treat animals in ways that reflect those patterns. If you learned that relationships are temporary, that connection is conditional, that love isn't reliable, you might extend those assumptions to your relationship with a dog. Research has found correlations between childhood trauma, particularly neglect or inconsistent caregiving, and later treatment of animals. People who never experienced secure attachment themselves often struggle to provide it to others, including pets. This doesn't excuse abandonment, but it contextualizes it within a larger pattern of damaged attachment capacity. There's also simple ignorance. Many people genuinely don't understand that dogs form deep psychological attachments, that abandonment is traumatic, that dogs have emotional lives comparable in many ways to human emotional lives. They think of the dog as an animal whose needs are primarily physical: food, water, shelter. The idea that the dog has psychological needs, that the bond matters to the dog's well-being, that separation causes genuine suffering, this understanding is missing. And without it, abandonment seems less serious, more like rehoming an object than traumatizing a sentient being. Economic desperation makes people do things they wouldn't otherwise do. When you're choosing between feeding your children and feeding your dog, when you're being evicted and have nowhere to go, when you're in a crisis that overwhelms your capacity to think clearly, moral reasoning can collapse under the weight of survival imperatives. This doesn't make abandonment right, but it makes it understandable as a desperate act in impossible circumstances rather than simple cruelty. Cultural factors play a role too. In some contexts, dogs are not seen as family members but as property or tools, working animals, guard animals, breeding stock. When the dog no longer serves their function, disposing of them seems reasonable within that framework. Emotional attachment to animals varies culturally, and in contexts where dogs aren't valued as companions, abandonment carries less social stigma. Mental illness can be a factor. Depression, substance abuse, psychosis, severe anxiety. These conditions impair judgment and capacity for care. Someone in a major depressive episode might abandon their dog not out of cruelty, but out of inability to function, an overwhelming sense that they can't care for anyone including themselves. This is still harmful to the dog, but it requires understanding as a symptom of illness rather than simple bad character. The psychological aftermath for humans who abandon dogs varies. Some feel no remorse, having successfully convinced themselves the dog is fine, or that it wasn't their responsibility anyway. Others carry guilt that haunts them, surfacing in unexpected moments, creating shame they can never quite resolve. Some develop avoidance. They can never have another dog because the guilt is too strong. Some repeat the pattern, getting and abandoning multiple dogs, each time telling themselves it will be different. What's most important to understand is that abandonment often happens at the intersection of external circumstances and internal psychological mechanisms. Very few people abandon dogs purely out of sadism. Most do it because circumstances overwhelmed their capacity for care, and psychological defenses allowed them to act in ways that, from a clearer perspective, they might recognize as harmful. This doesn't remove responsibility. Adults are responsible for the consequences of their actions regardless of circumstances. But it complicates simple narratives of good people versus bad people. Something remarkable happens when an abandoned dog meets a human willing to do the hard work of healing. It's the encounter of two damaged psychologies: the dog who learned that attachment leads to abandonment, and often, a human who carries their own wounds, their own reasons for choosing a traumatized animal rather than an easy one. And in that encounter, if both are lucky and if the human is patient, healing becomes possible. The process of rehabilitating an abandoned dog is essentially the process of rebuilding attachment. Everything John Bowlby understood about secure attachment applies here. The dog needs to learn that this human is reliable, that proximity is safe, that their needs will be met consistently. But unlike a puppy forming attachment for the first time, this dog has already learned the opposite lessons, so every step forward is harder, every trust milestone more significant. It starts with time and patience. A traumatized dog can't be rushed. They need space to approach on their own terms, to test whether this new person is safe. Many rescuers of abandoned dogs describe weeks or months where the dog barely interacted with them, staying across the room, flinching at sudden movements, refusing to make eye contact. This isn't rejection. It's self-protection. The dog is assessing whether this human can be trusted, and that assessment takes time when trust has been shattered. Consistency is essential when rehabilitating an abandoned dog. Showing up every day with food, calm presence, and predictability slowly teaches the dog that separation is temporary and safety can return. Over time, the nervous system begins to settle. Vigilance eases and the dog cautiously reopens to proximity, touch, and affection. There is often a turning point: sustained eye contact, voluntary approach, or deep sleep, marking the dog's decision to risk attachment again. This shift is profound because it represents trust returning after betrayal. Healing, however, is not linear. Traumatized dogs often regress when triggered by noise, sudden movements, or routine changes. This isn't failure but the nature of trauma. Fear pathways remain and can reactivate under stress. Progress means fear becomes less dominant, not erased. People who successfully help abandoned dogs tend to share key psychological traits: patience, emotional resilience, the ability to give without immediate reward, and not taking rejection personally. Many are healing themselves and recognize their own wounds in the dog's fear. The process often becomes mutual healing, both learning to trust again. Not all stories end well. Some dogs remain too damaged to live safely in homes and require lifelong sanctuary care. Some humans, despite good intentions, lack the resources or capacity to meet the demands of rehabilitation. Still, when healing succeeds, the transformation is remarkable. Withdrawn dogs play again. Fearful dogs seek closeness. Flinching dogs lean into touch. These changes are neurological, not just behavioral. Safe attachment rewires the brain. Abandoned dogs teach us powerful lessons about attachment and resilience. They show that trust can sometimes be rebuilt after profound betrayal, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. They also reveal that love can survive deep harm, and that choosing connection again requires courage. Dogs don't forgive in a human sense, but they risk attachment again despite trauma. This willingness to reconnect highlights a form of bravery that mirrors human healing as well. Psychologically, abandoned dogs demonstrate that attachment is not weakness, but a biological necessity. Their suffering reveals the moral weight of attachment. When a being depends on you for safety, responsibility is created. Walking away causes real harm, a truth that applies to dogs and to human relationships alike. Their capacity to trust again shows that damage is not always permanent. With consistency and care, healing is possible. Their loyalty also reflects qualities humans value deeply: devotion, commitment, and unconditional presence, often expressed more purely in dogs than in people. Abandonment teaches that freedom and responsibility are inseparable. Enjoying companionship carries an obligation to protect another being's physical and psychological well-being. This applies to all relationships, not only to pets. If you have a dog, honor the bond. To your dog, you are their world. When keeping a dog becomes difficult, seek alternatives before abandonment. Support responsible rehoming and use available resources. Abandonment should be a last resort. If you're considering adoption, understand it is a long-term commitment to another being's emotional life. If you cannot offer that stability, it's better not to adopt. And if you've abandoned a dog before, let guilt transform future behavior by supporting rescues, educating others, and never repeating the harm. Ultimately, the psychology of abandoned dogs mirrors human psychology. It exposes our capacity to wound and our capacity to heal. In their loyalty, fear, and resilience, dogs show us what it means to truly commit to the bonds we create and remind us of the responsibility that love demands.